have to read because I actually am personal friends with some of Harvey Weinstein's victims, so there's a chance I can become a hinge. So I'm just going to read. Rose, this is for you. Okay, the Me Too movement was created to highlight the scope of sexual abuse. When we women took to social media and our personal stories of assault and harassment, we realized two things. We are not alone, and as a group, they can't ignore us and dismiss us anymore. The fallout was immediate and have left men thinking that they have been unfairly targeted and that the Me Too movement has gone too far. Since I began advocating against sexual violence 7 years ago, the change has been significant. In the past, men, while sympathetic, didn't want to engage the conversation because they saw it as a woman's issue. Now they want to actively participate and is rarely in support privately. I was in Italy and Spain last week, and men everywhere wanted to talk about it because it is affecting them personally. While both genders agree that rape is wrong and illegal, it is the harassment that is widening the gap. There's still many men that think that flirting at work is not only okay, but is the right. And they're feeling that they're being punished for being men. Lately, also many powerful men have used their influence to try to widen the gap, like Roman Polanski calling it a mass hysteria. Men are speaking against the movement, like Anthony Robbins, suggesting that the Me Too movement was used by women to try to get significance and certainty by attacking and destroying someone else's. He went on to add that he personally knows many executives that are now skeptic of hiring women they find attractive, even when those women are very qualified for the job because of the Me Too movement. Women are once again cheated from rightful positions and are no longer invited to the table. Do I think the gender gap has widened since the Me Too movement? Yes, I do. But it's not because of the Me Too movement, but rather how organizations and corporations responded to the movement that has widened the gap. Instead of damage control, do more soul searching. It's not a witch hunt, it's a reckoning. Following up accusations is not an inconvenience. It is the right thing to do. The Me Too movement is not to blame for the fallout of these prominent men. It is themselves and those who enable the behavior they are to blame. The Me Too movement is not a proper channel for these allegations. It was born out of desperation. By the time it goes to the Me Too movement and publicly, you have not done your job. The movement hasn't gone too far. What we experience is years of ignoring victims. Am I supposed to feel sorry for a man who was forced to resign or fire because he spent the last 23 years harassing women? No. And as to the question of following due course, yes, you should, of course. But it is on you for not following on these allegations sooner. If you want to bridge the gap, do the one thing you didn't do from the beginning and got us in this mess. Listen to women. We are human beings. We're your peers. We're your partners. We're not here for entertainment. I can't wait until the Me Too movement becomes not me, and the Time's Up movement becomes it was about damn time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Sorry, I should have introduced before. That was Norma Bastidas, the CEO of Adventure Documentaries. And you should get extra points to the audience for finishing 30 seconds early. Congratulations. First up to argue that the Me Too movement has not worsened the divide is, I am having trouble with people's names here, is Dr. Keltner. Sorry, Dr. Keltner, a professor at the University of California in Berkeley.
Thank you, Jodi. It's great to be around so many empowered women. I was raised by a women's studies professor fighting early. I'm raising 2 empowered daughters. It gives me a lot of hope to be here, and it's a privilege to be part of these conversations. We are learning from the archaeological record that 12 to 15,000 years ago, as we moved into large settlements, 2 toxic social ideas emerged in our social organization. The first was that one human being could own another human being in the form of slavery, and the second is that men could control women sexually and in other ways. And I really view the Me Too movement as the latest moving chapter in a history of movements towards promoting rights and reducing harm in our culture. And I put it on par with Thomas Clarkson's work with the abolitionist movement promoting ideas about slave ships, with the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, and other history-changing movements. It is that important. We know from the latest social neuroscience that the Me Too movement and the voice that it'll give women will be good for women's brains. There are studies showing that when a woman hears about sexist or oppressive ideas, pain regions of her brain are activated, threat-related regions of her brain are activated, cortisol rises, and she is in a permanent state of threat and defense that is bad for creativity, empowerment, and the body. And I see Me Too as countering that. So the question is the Me Too movement good for the relationships between women and men and reducing the divide that has existed for 12 to 15,000 years? And again, we can consult the science and social science to see that the answer is yes. There are a lot of studies coming out, for example, by Lolita Peplau, showing that when friendships between women and men, work relationships between women and men, and partnerships between women and men are more equal, the couple is happier, the friends are happier, they feel more trusting and collaborative and kind towards each other. We know from work by Peggy Reeves-Sandé, and Lori will talk about some of the developments of this, that as women are more empowered and have more voice, all of the atrocities that spurred the Me Too movement are reduced. So Peggy Reeves-Sandé has looked at 150 cultures across historical periods and across continents, and what you find is as women rise in power, you see a reduction in bullying and sexual assault and rape and sexism. It's going to improve relations in that way. We also know from recent work that as women rise in power, it will lead to greater economic equality. And there's a very important literature on economic equality that shows that as economic equality rises, both women and men feel more trusting of each other, more cooperative, more collaborative, they're happier, prejudice and sexism reduce. As women rise, they will lift up the welfare of men around them. And then finally, very interestingly and somewhat ironically, there are new studies showing that as women gain voice and power through movements like this, through the Me Too movement and rise, they will create the social and economic conditions that will kind of take out the passion of the men who are most likely to feel divided by the movement. We're learning from recent work at the University of Pennsylvania that the most disaffected men are and really most likely to feel a divide vis-a-vis women are men who have lost their jobs and lost status recently. You put women in power, they'll create the economic conditions that benefit those men, thus helping that divide. It's a no-brainer, sorry, my apologies to the other side. The Me Too movement is going to create a lot of conditions that improve health, happiness, and the social conditions between women and men. Our hope is to move history towards greater equality as part of this movement. Thank you.
Thank you. Very, very impressive for the academics, bringing all the research and studies there. It's a nice trick. I hope you've noticed that I'm trying to neutralize the field by sitting in either side. I hope that's helping. Anyway, now we have Jess Tomlin, the president and CEO of Match International Women's Fund.
Thank you. So I think it's an important thing to think about as we talk about this resolution, to recognize the moment that we're in. Nobody on this panel in their right mind is going to argue that Me Too isn't a good thing, but Me Too hurts real bad right now. And it's playing out in women's lives, and it's playing out in women's bodies. So has the divide increased? Absolutely, right now. A recent survey that just to compliment my academic peer on the other side of the stage, a recent survey that interviewed about 1,200 men, young and mature, asked all sorts of questions that revealed that we don't really understand the basics. 1 in 3 men in this country understand what consent looks like. 64% of men have very skewed versions of what is consensual sex, what is voyeurism, et cetera, and 1 in 3 Canadians can effectively define what consent actually means. So what this reveals to me is that the deeply held, deeply entrenched cultures, norms, attitudes, behaviors, and systems that are holding women back, Those are the things that have yet to shift, and that's a price women continue to pay. We put this in the global context, and that, I think, is articulated even to a greater extent, given the fact that 1 in 5 girls in the world will be married before she's 18. And in Canada, in this country, a university campus, the place of highest education, is the second most dangerous person for a Canadian woman to be. So until we address these big systemic issues and use the opportunity of Me Too to really unearth this conversation, then I'm worried that that divide will not come together once again. I think it's important also to reflect on how these movements work. Just as Me Too didn't come from a vacuum, women have been fighting for their rights for centuries, and this is an opportunity that has accelerated progress brought on by unique moments in time and unique events. We see this across human rights movements all over the world. We see it, for example, in the civil rights movement. Black Lives Matter did not come out of a vacuum. But what has it done? It has increased a divide, and you can see that playing out on the streets in the US with unarmed black men and police officers. So yes, it hurts real bad, and it hurts right now, but it's not forever. This is how change happens. I would finally just say, I think it's important to note that Me Too is available to some, but not all. When we are working in precarious conditions, when we are single mothers, when we are non-documented workers, when our income is the only piece of the only way in which our children will survive, and our boss asks for something on the side, well, she does not have the privilege or the luxury to say Me Too. So that not only runs a risk of creating a bigger divide between men and women, but privileged women and underprivileged women. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess, and I'm so glad that you mentioned consent, because it gives me an opportunity to plug. We published this afternoon an amazing collection of stories by college students around the world on sex in the gray zone and issues of consent. So I commend that to you. I hope you all will leave the debate and go check, not right now on your phones, but later, look at nytimes.com. And next, we have Lori Edelman, who is the Director of Youth Engagement for Women Deliver.
The so-called gender divide on Me Too is fake news. In fact, all of our fates are bound together. Progress towards gender equality, including reducing the kind of gender-based violence that inspired so many across the globe to say Me Too in recent weeks, drives power and progress for all women, men and young people included, worldwide. Solving this global scourge of gender-based violence is actually one of the key investments that we can make as a society to achieve the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda that we've been talking about so much today, and we know is a shared goal for all of us. While Me Too has ignited an urgent and life-saving global conversation, sexual assault and violence is hardly a new or small issue, and it doesn't only affect a tiny fraction. We know the staggering truth that 1 in 3 women globally will suffer physical or sexual abuse in her lifetime. Nearly half of all sexual assaults are committed against girls younger than 16 years old. That's hundreds of millions of people, including many children. How many girls leave school because of early marriage, pregnancy, or violence? How many give birth before they turn 15? They also need to be part of the Me Too conversation. That's why girl and youth-led advocacy is essential to break the cycle of violence and achieve a safer, more equitable world for all. These girls and women, they're not up for debate, but their experiences should be of concern to everyone, and many of them are themselves leading the way and finding innovative solutions. Strong legal and policy frameworks are needed to recognize, prevent, and respond to all forms of gender-based violence and inequality facing girls and women. But 37 countries still exempt rape perpetrators from prosecution when they are married to or subsequently marry the victim. That has to change. And actually, young men, they've already gotten the memo. Perhaps you're aware of the He for She campaign launched by UN Women in 2014. Emma Watson's a well-known ambassador, but actually so are a number of Women Deliver young leaders. who happen to be male. I think about Stephen Twino Mugisha, a 27-year-old in Uganda who works with nonprofits to change attitudes about gender and family planning. We don't separate boys and girls when we give classes, he says. A boy has a sister at home or a girlfriend. If you put him on the sidelines, the ignorance continues. Educating young people in this way is the only true long-term solution to gender-based violence. And actually, when delivered well, comprehensive sexuality education plays a key role in this battle against sexual and gender-based violence by promoting respect for each other, for human rights frameworks, and for consent. This doesn't just affect girls and women, but allows people of all genders to lead full and healthy lives of pleasure and consent. So again, I say that gender divide around Me Too, that's fake news. Without half of the world's population able to achieve their full potential, all of us will never be able to see the progress that we could otherwise. That's why now more than ever, champions of all kinds, especially everyone here in this room today, must collectively mobilize around the issues affecting the health, rights, and well-being of girls and women everywhere. When this happens, everyone wins, and that's why we invite everyone here as well to join us in a year of mobilization leading up to a conference in Vancouver next year in June 2019 that will be the largest global conference on girls' health and rights worldwide with Women Deliver 2019. Thanks.
Thank you, Lori. Thank you for making me not the only one plugging. And Dacher, we're on to your tactic of nodding along. We've got it. So next we have Lisa Kimmel, who's the president and CEO of Edelman Canada.
Thank you. So one of the consequences of any cultural revolution is a tendency towards excess. And I would argue that in many circumstances, that is what we are seeing with the Me Too movement, where it's currently at. Jodi referenced the Mike Pence rule. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Mike Pence has a rule that he will not be alone with a woman unless his wife is present. I will tell you that from all of the male executives, business leaders who are in my own network, they have said that his rule is a smart one. It is alive and well amongst men. And it's because they have a fear that if they are alone with a woman, they may be accused of sexual misconduct. And therefore, they want to reduce their risk profile to zero. And so I had heard this anecdotally, and then that was actually proven through a lean-in study that was published in February, which found that male managers are 3 times as likely now to be uncomfortable mentoring a woman, and twice as uncomfortable to work alone with a woman. Second point I want to make is that we currently live in a trial by Twitter environment. And unless we recognize the importance of due process, men and women on this issue are going to grow further apart. The reality is that there is a difference between Harvey Weinstein, a serial rapist and predator, and the likes of Tom Brokaw, or Glenn Thrush, or Ryan Litza. And I think it's easy to dismiss the concerns of men, recognizing that women face significant systemic barriers. However, we can't ignore the need for due process. Men who are accused of sexual harassment are entitled to be innocent until proven guilty. And I hadn't really considered the plight of men in this current environment until a very good male friend of mine called me to let me know that he had been accused of sexual misconduct at a corporate function. And to hear the terror in his voice, and he adamantly denied doing anything wrong, but he automatically went to, my career is over. My family will be publicly humiliated. I am going to automatically be viewed as guilty. Now, fortunately, he was, through a corporate internal investigation, vindicated. But it's also a similar reaction when Tom Brokaw, 2 weeks ago, was accused of sexual misconduct. And one from more than 20 years ago, another one from over 50 years ago. And he said in his statement, "It's 4 a.m. on the first day of my life as an accused predator." There is a spectrum of behaviors and actions, and they can't all be treated the same. And so unless men who are accused are granted due process, the divide will only increase. We need to view feminism not as gender tribalism, and as the mother of a son, and the sister of a brother, and the daughter of a father. Unless we recognize the importance of due process, the polarization between the genders is only going to grow larger.
Thank you, Lisa. And wrapping up this portion of the debate, we have Rahaf Harfouch, who is a professor at Sciences Po and co-founder of Red Thread.
Hi. They all brought the facts. I think I'm just going to bring the rage because I am enraged by this entire situation. So I just want us to remember that the Me Too movement in its original form on Twitter was about solidarity. It wasn't about naming names, and it wasn't about deciding or judging or giving a verdict. It was about raising a hand and saying, "This happened to me too." And this movement really signified a couple of big changes. One, I just want us to recognize that this is not a divide, this is a disease. This is a disease that is infecting every single industry, from campuses to financial organizations, from Hollywood to insurance companies to consumer packaged goods to agencies. And what this movement has shown is that it has exposed this rot for what it is: insidious and prevalent. And it hasn't made the divide worse, it has just made this disease visible. Everything that has happened to these women has happened before. It continues to happen. The difference now is that we are talking about it. The second thing I want to point out is that it's important to recognize that any social movement is always going to have backlash. From the civil movements to the LGBTQA fight, anytime we confront somebody in a position of power and let them know that they might have to take accountability for behaviors that have been previously overlooked, ignored, dismissed, they're going to be pretty mad. And that anger is a normal part of this recalibration process that we need to have. So it's important to remember what Sophie Trudeau mentioned earlier, that things that are repressed must be expressed. And a lot of the reactions that you're seeing now is a response to this ugly, uncomfortable feeling that lets some of these people know that, hey, the things that I have been doing have not been okay, and they are happening everywhere all around me. Finally, I would like us to reframe this issue, because coming from a high school debate club back in the day, I will say that I am a little bit of a stickler for definitions of words. And I think it's important to frame this not as a divide between men and women, but as a divide between decent people and predators. This is not about men, this is not about women. This is about people who follow the rules and people who systemically abuse power and knowingly do so. And I think if we simplify it to a gender issue, then we are missing opportunities to create more fruitful collaborations and more productive relationships anyway. Also, if your reaction to all of this is to stop having meetings with women, like the Mike Pence approach that we've mentioned, I would actually urge you to look in the mirror about what it reveals about how you look at women, how you value women, and how you respect women. Because, thank you. I refuse to commend or I refuse to apologize for the fact that now being a predator has become harder because they're at risk of being called out on Twitter. Okay, it's no longer my problem. Finally, just on a more personal note, I think it's very important that we stand up in solidarity for this movement. There are detractors of this movement, which makes me furious, that try to insinuate that participating in this act of solidarity is actually a way to celebrate victimhood. I would encourage you to look at what happens to some of these women who raise their hands and actually say and tell their story. They get death threats, they get rape threats, they get their reputations completely destroyed, and their lives get destroyed as well. So we need to honor the courage of these women that have come at great personal and professional cost to tell us what is really going on. And therefore, I believe that we need to be very clear about how we talk about this to make sure that we never imply in any way, unintentional or not, that these women are responsible for the current conditions that we face today. It is our duty to support each other. It is our duty to be patient. It is our duty to have due process. But ultimately, if your response to all of this is, I wish we could go back to a time when things were less complicated, guess what? It's always been this complicated. And if you're not a part of the solution, then you're a part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I want to just remind you how it's going to go now. We are lucky to have with us 3 amazing commenters or judges who are going to reflect on what they've heard and pose some questions. Then the teams are going to have a couple of minutes to discuss amongst themselves, and then we'll hear from one person from each team again, and then you, the actual jury of the people, will vote. So I wanted to invite up on stage now Alexandra, I'm sorry, I really need reading glasses now. Alexandra Bolvin, who's the head of the regional delegation for the US and Canada of the ICRC. Kate McNeil Keller, who's a partner at McCarthy Tétrault. And the Honorable Mariam Monsef, the Minister on the Status of Women for Canada. And we don't have seats for you, so you're going to speak quickly. You're supposed to just stand and go in order. I think you can do that, yeah. Is that fine? They can speak from these, yeah? Okay, terrific, thank you.
So I work for a humanitarian organization, and we are having our Me Too moment as well. And it is maybe not front page news, but it's happening, it's not over, and it's painful. It's particularly painful because it challenges who we are as humanitarians and what we stand for. It's also painful because it erodes the hard-earned trust that we work for with the communities that we serve. And in a war zone, trust is a rare commodity. Mistrust is the norm. So you cannot operate on the front lines of Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, or Somalia if you're not accepted, if you're not trusted. And this may seem like an obvious point, but it's one that I wanted to bring to you because in the recent discussions around sexual abuse and exploitation, there's been a tendency to emphasize the reputational part of the issue and perhaps underrepresent the existential part of this issue for us as humanitarians. So that's part of our Me Too moment that bridges to another one, which connects me to everybody in this room, which is essentially our internal dynamics as an organization and our need for a cultural shift when it comes to preventing and sanctioning unacceptable behavior in the workplace. And as we get our house in order, it's incredibly important to be able to speak to others and to be in conversations like these. So I'd just like to thank the organizers for making it possible for me to be here and to learn from everybody who's taken part in this debate. Now, bringing it to the debate. What we have heard is an acknowledgement that as good and necessary as the Me Too movement is, it does cause some collateral damage. And the question that has been ably tackled by both sides is essentially the extent to which that collateral damage is just par for the course, proportionate when you compare it with the gains that we will achieve for women in the workplace and women in society, and what kind of measures we need to put in place to mitigate that harm to the extent that we're willing to acknowledge that there is some collateral damage. And so my question would be essentially to come and look at that in space of convergence between both sides of the debate and say, since we're willing to acknowledge that at least in the short term, It's not in our interest to exclude or estrange men from this conversation. What would be the one piece of advice that you would have us all go home with in order to get the men at the table feeling like they can be part of the solution? Thank you.
I think she's going to go to, excuse me? Whatever.
I'm going to speak from this side to make sure that there's some even representation, and then the minister can speak from the center, perhaps. In my practice as a labor and employment lawyer, I represent employers. And so day to day, these issues are at the forefront of the advice and the representation that I have to counsel my clients on. And as this movement has unfolded and as the momentum and the discussion has evolved, one of the biggest struggles that I find myself having in terms of the self-reflection is this challenge around due process, the challenge around believing the victim, the challenge around accepting the dialogue and the conversation about the issues, and how do my clients bring that back into their environment, and how do I, as a woman, as a mom to a young boy who I hope will be a feminist, and all of and as a member of my community, what role do I play? Because one of the biggest challenges we've heard is the role of lawyers, for example, in silencing issues, in imposing confidentiality, in shutting down the conversation. And there's a really interesting challenge there to be had with the due process concept. And it's a struggle that I've had, and as I listen to our speakers today and as our debaters who have all had fantastic perspectives, one of the challenges that really strikes me was Norma's comment around the fact that it's not the movement, but the reaction to the movement. It's not the core of the issue, but how as human beings we come together to respond. And I guess one of the questions that comes to my mind, I reflect on what Alex has said around, well, what's the piece of advice? I guess when you bring it down to the micro level of the workplace, when you bring it down to the day-to-day interpersonal relationships that the members of our community have, what can we as individuals do to influence the conversation? What can we do to change the course of our workplace, of our relationships, of our experiences? Because when I'm consulted, there are often two things I'm trying to deal with. One is to exit relationships because somebody wants to leave or someone has to leave a workplace. More rarely am I looked to, or are my clients looking to, how do we fix the relationship? And I think that conversation is shifting. And so one of the things that I think I'd like to hear from our esteemed debaters today is, to the extent that you can bring this to the micro and you can look at what can we do in Canada, in our communities, to affect change in our workplaces, in our relationships, where do you think the biggest lost opportunity has been, and where can we do better than we have in order to affect that change?
I'm a liberal, so I'll stick to the middle of the floor. Bonjour, hello, Anin, salam alaikum. It's a privilege to be on this traditional territory that so many Indigenous peoples have called home for generations upon generations. Mississaugas of the New Credit included, and settlers like me and many of us in this room come here together to explore ideas, to challenge assumptions, and to come up with solutions. I'm proud to be here for a number of reasons. I'm the Minister for Women in Canada. I serve a feminist prime minister as part of a feminist government. We're chairing the G7 this year. The conversations you're having amongst yourselves, out there on social media, the report that comes out of this gathering will help shape the outcomes that the Government of Canada, as chair of this year's G7, is going to take to the leaders of the most industrialized, powerful nations in the world. So I'm in a room with a lot of privileged folks, and I have ulterior motives. Firstly, congratulations. Each of you not only finished on time, but you brought forward to the forefront the challenges and the paradox inherent in this social movement that we are all a part of right now. Canada is working, and we're about to go out and engage broadly with Canadians for a strategy specifically to engage men and boys in a conversation about gender equality. This is an important moment. We have a window of time, and for so many years, the silence has prevented us from having a conversation, and we are in the midst of an uncomfortable but courageous conversation, as both sides have stated. I believe that there is a paradox inherent here, and that paradox is part of, I think, where we're pulled on either side of this conversation as individuals and as communities and as countries. That paradox needs to be explored. We believe, as a federal government, that when we invest in women, we grow the economy for everyone. We improve communities for everyone. And I think everybody in this room agrees with that. The flip side of that, of course, is when there is inequality, everyone pays the price. So because I've come here with an ulterior motive, and my job actually isn't to judge you, which I thought was my job. My job is, I think, to ask you, what advice do you have for us, the Government of Canada, as we're about to embark on a courageous and probably uncomfortable conversation at times with Canadians and other experts about how to engage men and boys in this very important conversation in this important moment in time.
Thank you, Minister. Okay, we are ready now. So we're going to start with the con team, I guess is what you are. So Lori's going to wrap it up for them, and then we'll turn for the last word to this side.
Thanks so much. So we're so grateful to our esteemed judges for bringing up the burning questions and giving us this extra opportunity to respond. Especially two of the three of you mentioned explicitly and asked for advice around engaging men and boys. And we think that's a really important part of this conversation. First of all, men and boys already are engaged with this movement, which kind of reinforces this idea that my co-debaters have brought up really eloquently, that this is not a gender debate. This is a debate between decency and principles and what our societies will tolerate. And so our advice to men and boys is first listen. Don't forget to kind of sit in this moment, hear the testimonies that are happening all around us. And by the way, some men say me too. So that's important to emphasize. And then also, once you've listened, and as you continue to listen, don't resist this moment, embrace it. That is our advice to men and boys. Be part of this movement, join us, and take action. And we would extend that as well to the Canadian government and their important efforts in this area to really make sure that there are opportunities for men and boys to take part in this movement, as they already are, but that also we leave space for the women who are also bravely leading the way. We also want to talk about that very important question about the missed opportunity of this moment and what we don't want to skip over it too quickly. Right now, we have this really unprecedented opportunity, and in our conversation today, we went back, I think Docker went back several thousand years, something to the beginning of society, to really look at the big picture in all of this. We are getting to some fundamental social norms with this conversation that go back generations and generations and generations, and the work will not happen overnight. So we really need to embrace the opportunity of this moment and not skip over it. Rather than go immediately to, well, how can I make sure no one knows about this or it goes away right away? Let's actually say, well, besides holding perpetrators accountable, which is really important, how can we actually make sure we have a workplace that is gender sensitive, that is friendly to women, to families. We know that actually when you have paid maternity leave, paid paternity leave, that improves the health of not only the families, but the communities. There are ripple effects to investing in girls and women that also benefit boys and men. And so we ask not only the private sector and corporations and businesses that are grappling with this moment, but people from all different sectors of society, people working in government, people working at CSOs, in humanitarian and relief efforts, and all of those other actors in this space, embrace the change, don't resist it, and we'll all emerge for the better.
Thank you, Lori. And our final speaker in today's debate, Jess.
Drew the short straw, in fact. It's interesting because two of the key questions that were asked relate to the convergence and how to draw the one most salient piece of advice for men and the minister's question relates to, good, fearless advice around how to engage men and boys. And it's interesting because this debate is quickly turning to the what about the men, and I understand that there is that the men are largely the perpetrators of this, but it isn't. I'm not comfortable with the fact that we're skipping over the women a little. And so my esteemed debate colleague gave me a statistic, which is that it's in Canada, Lisa? 95% of CEOs surveyed in Canada said that sexual harassment doesn't exist in the workplace, except for 94% of survey respondents were men. So that's the state of play, and I think it's interesting because I think many of us, I know we talked about this on our side, have had esteemed colleagues, men, who are CEOs running organizations who are panicking right now. They're so nervous. They're looking back on their history and the way in which they behaved when there wasn't this new world order, and they're thinking about all the things that they did because their privilege and their access and their culture and whatever else allowed them to do that. And I think the first instinct is fear, like how do I round this out so it doesn't seem so bad? But I think if we are to get to the questions that were asked by the judges around one big piece of advice and how can we truly affect change, it's let's move the conversation so it's really brave. So let's not look at fixing the past, but as this country is in a moment of reconciliation with its indigenous people, let's then do the same between men and women. So instead of saying, I'm sure it wasn't that bad, it was okay back then, let's reconcile the truth. And let's say, you know what? You probably did. You probably did behave badly. You probably did abuse your power. You probably did abuse your privilege. You probably made her uncomfortable. What's next? And those are the kinds of brave conversations, we believe, will truly unearth that next big step, that moment that we're in, and make it meaningful to truly accelerate progress. Because until we accept that, until we make moves towards that reconciliation, unfortunately, I don't think we'll get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jess, and to all of our speakers. And I should say, you all are very, very brave, speaking with a clock ticking down. I know you don't all know that, but we have this big red clock here telling how many seconds we have left. It's quite stressful. And so it's going to be your moment of truth in just a second. We were going to have PricewaterhouseCoopers count secret ballots, but since they were tarred by the Academy Award scandal, we're going to go with the old-fashioned clap-o-meter. And I want you to know that the stakes here are very, very high. In addition to the minister being influenced by whatever your vote is, I'm sure, on her policy agenda. Also, we have free New York Times buttons for everybody on the winning team. We also have them available to all of you as well. But and no, there will be bragging rights. Look, we are very proud to be part of this debate. We are, what we believe in at the New York Times, and I think what the Women's Forum is also really about, is having kind of open dialogue, confronting hard issues, and moving things forward. So, without further ado, I'm going to call the question. All those who believe that the discussion around the Me Too movement has worsened the divide between women and men, please clap. Thank you. And all those who believe the discussion around the Me Too movement has not worsened the divide between women and men? Well, I have to say, if you see a little sadness in my face, it's because we had this plan of making you stand up if it wasn't clear who won, but I'm afraid it is clear who won. So congratulations, the Me Too movement has not worsened the divide. Well done. You will get buttons anyway. Thank you to all the debaters. Thank you to everyone in the room. Are we staying in this room, Sophie, to hear Justin Trudeau? Yes, we are staying in this room. We're going to have a video message from Prime Minister Trudeau, I think, is happening. Yes? Maybe not yet. Somebody who knows what's going on will soon get on the stage and tell you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. That was just fabulous.